The Second World War, a conflict that consumed the globe, redrawing maps and rewriting the rules of human civilization. It's a story of ideologies, of empires, and of technology. But beneath the grand strategies and the marching armies, it is a story of human beings. From 1939 to 1945, an estimated 70 to 85 million people lost their lives. That number is so large it defies comprehension. It's the entire modern-day population of Germany, or Turkey, or Iran, simply erased from the earth. This colossal figure is built from individual tragedies, stacked one on top of the other, in places that would become infamous. These are the war's deadliest battles. But deadliest is a complex word. Does it mean the most casualties in a single day? The highest percentage of loss? Or the slow, grinding annihilation of entire populations over months, or even years? In this documentary, we will explore the battles that define the sheer scale of World War II's human cost. We will not just list names and dates. We will examine the anatomy of these confrontations. We'll explore the strategies that led to them, the unthinkable sacrifices demanded of soldiers and civilians, and the desperate fight for survival that defined a generation. This is the story of World War II's deadliest battles, explained. To understand the deadliest battles, one must first understand the Eastern Front. It was here, in the vast expanse between Berlin and Moscow, that the war's most brutal, ideological, and industrial-scale killing took place. This was not merely a war of conquest. It was, in the eyes of its architects, a war of annihilation. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, 3 million Axis soldiers stormed across the Soviet border. The German strategy was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, designed to cripple the Red Army and force a Soviet collapse in mere months. At first, the strategy was devastatingly effective, but the Soviet Union was not France or Poland. Its sheer size, its limitless manpower, and its brutal winters would become strategic factors as potent as any tank division. Our first stop is not a battle in the traditional sense, but a siege. The Siege of Leningrad. From September 1941 to January 1944, 872 agonizing days, the city of Leningrad was encircled by German and Finnish forces. The strategy was not to capture the city, but to starve it into submission. Adolf Hitler ordered that no surrender be accepted. The city and its 3 million inhabitants were to be, quote, wiped from the face of the earth. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The fight for survival became grotesque. With supply lines cut, rations dwindled to almost nothing. By November 1941, the daily bread ration for a civilian was just 125 grams, a few thin slices of a loaf, often baked with sawdust and cellulose. The city descended into a frozen nightmare. There was no heat, no water, no electricity. People burned their furniture, their books, their floorboards just to stay alive. They collapsed from starvation in the streets, their bodies left frozen for weeks. The only lifeline was the Road of Life, a perilous truck route driven across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. It was under constant German artillery and air attack. Drivers would sink into the icy water, sacrificing their lives to deliver a few more bags of flour. By the time the siege was finally broken, it's estimated that over 1 million civilians had died. Not from bombs, but from cold and hunger. The sacrifice was a city. The survival was a testament to a horrific, almost unbelievable human resilience. As Leningrad starved, the Blitzkrieg machine hammered at the gates of the capital. The Battle of Moscow, beginning in late 1941, was meant to be the final, decisive blow. German commanders believed that if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union would shatter. Strategically, they were almost right. By December, German reconnaissance units could see the spires of the Kremlin. But the strategy of lightning war had a fatal flaw. It had a deadline. The German army was not equipped for winter. The panzers, which had seemed invincible in the summer, now froze solid. Lubricants turned to gel, and engines refused to start. Soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, suffered from debilitating frostbite. And then the Soviets counterattacked. In a feat of logistical genius, the Soviets had secretly transferred fresh, battle-hardened divisions from Siberia. These troops were equipped for the cold. They were experienced winter fighters. They fell upon the frozen, exhausted German lines like wolves. The fight for survival was now against the element as much as the enemy. The German advance was halted, then pushed back hundreds of kilometers. It was the first time the Wehrmacht had been truly, decisively defeated on land. The sacrifice was immense. Soviet casualties in the defense and counterattack are estimated at over 1 million. But the strategy had worked. Moscow had held. The war in the East would not be a short one. This realization would find its ultimate, terrible expression a year later in a city on the Volga River. A city that would become the turning point of the entire war, Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the centerpiece of Case Blue, the 1942 summer German offensive. The goal was twofold: capture the city bearing Stalin's name for its immense propaganda value, and, more importantly, cut off the flow of oil from the Caucasus to the rest of the Soviet Union. What began as a conventional battle of movement quickly devolved into something else entirely. The Luftwaffe pounded the city into a field of rubble, but in doing so, they created the perfect defensive terrain. The ruins of Stalingrad became a fortress. This was no longer blitzkrieg, this was Rattenkrieg. The fighting was not street to street, but room to room, floor to floor. The front line was a blurry, terrifying concept, often separated by a single brick wall. A building would be held by the Germans on the top floor and the Soviets in the basement. The Soviet 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuiko refused to yield. Their strategy was simple: to hug the enemy. They kept their positions so close to the Germans that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb them without hitting their own troops. For months, the two armies tore each other apart in the ruins. But all the while, the Soviet High Command under General Zhukov was planning something bigger. In November 1942, they launched Operation Uranus. While the German Sixth Army was fixated on the city, two massive Soviet pinchers smashed through the weaker Romanian and Hungarian forces on its flanks. In just 4 days, the trap snapped shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. Hitler, in a fatal strategic blunder, forbade a breakout. He promised to supply the army by air, but the air bridge was a catastrophic failure. The Sixth Army was left to freeze and starve, just as the civilians of Leningrad had. The fight for survival inside the Kessel, or cauldron, was horrific. Trapped in the Russian winter with no food, no fuel, and no hope, the army disintegrated. When Field Marshal Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943 against Hitler's explicit orders, it was a world-shattering event. Of the nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped, only 91,000 were left to surrender. And of those 91,000, only 6,000 would ever see their homes again. The total casualties for the Battle of Stalingrad, German, Soviet, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, and civilian, are estimated to be near 2 million people. 2 million in a single battle. It was the psychological and material breaking point of the Third Reich. From Stalingrad onward, the path to Berlin was a long, bloody retreat.
While the giants clashed in Russia, a different kind of war was being fought across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The war against Imperial Japan was not one of large land-based armies, but of naval power, amphibious assaults, and a cultural divide that made the fighting uniquely savage. Here, the strategy was island hopping, The goal was to bypass Japanese strongholds and seize only the key islands, the ones with airfields that could serve as stepping stones on the long road to Tokyo. This strategy led to some of the most concentrated and brutal fighting of the entire war. The Japanese military code of Bushido, twisted into a no-surrender death cult, meant that every island had to be taken by force and every defender killed almost to the last man. We see this at Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic rock, just 8 square miles. Strategically, its value was immense. Its airfields could be used by damaged B-29 bombers returning from Japan and as a base for fighter escorts. The Japanese commander, Tadamichi Kuribayashi, knew he couldn't win. His strategy was simply to kill as many Americans as possible before he was overrun. He turned Iwo Jima into a subterranean fortress, 15 miles of tunnels, interlocking pillboxes, and hidden artillery positions. The 21,000 Japanese defenders did not fight on the beaches. They waited. They let the Marines land, and then they unleashed a torrent of fire from their hidden positions. The battle was a 36-day nightmare of flamethrowers, explosives, and close-quarters combat. The sacrifice was staggering for such a small piece of land. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, all but 1,000 were killed. The American cost was just as shocking. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed and another 20,000 wounded. It was the only battle in the Pacific where American casualties outnumbered the Japanese. And yet, Iwo Jima was just the prelude. The deadliest battle of the Pacific War was still to come, the Battle of Okinawa. Okinawa was the last stepping stone. It was Japanese home soil, part of the Ryukyu Islands. The Americans called it the Typhoon of Steel for the sheer volume of firepower unleashed. The battle, which began in April 1945, was a brutal 82-day slug. The Japanese strategy was identical to Iwo Jima, but on a massive scale. The terrain of southern Okinawa, a maze of hills and caves, became a fortress. But Okinawa was different. It had a large indigenous civilian population, and this is what makes the battle so tragic. The Japanese High Command, in its desperation, treated the Okinawan civilians as expendable. They were forced into labor, used as human shield, and, in a horrifying twist, told that the Americans were white devils who would torture and kill them. As the battle turned against the Japanese, this propaganda had a terrible effect. Japanese soldiers ordered civilians to commit mass suicide rather than surrender. In some cases, they gave them grenades to do it. Families jumped from cliffs, mothers killing their own children before taking their own lives. On the sea, the Japanese unleashed the Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum operations. These were mass suicidal attacks by kamikaze pilots. Over 1,900 kamikaze missions were flown, sinking 36 Allied ships and damaging hundreds more. It was the sacrifice of an entire generation of pilots in a final, hopeless gesture. By the time the battle ended in June, the numbers were beyond belief. Over 110,000 Japanese and Okinawan conscripted soldiers were dead. The American military suffered over 75,000 casualties, with 14,000 killed. And the most horrific statistic is the civilian cost. As many as 150,000 Okinawan civilians, a third of the island's population, were killed in the crossfire or died by their own hand. The battle for Okinawa was so deadly, its sacrifice so profound, that it directly influenced the most significant strategic decision of the 20th century. The fight for survival on that island convinced American leaders that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would cost over 1 million American casualties and many millions of Japanese lives. Okinawa was the argument that ended the debate. It led directly to the decision to use the atomic bomb. As the war in the Pacific reached its crescendo, the war in Europe was entering its final agonizing act. The Western Front had been reopened on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Battle of Normandy itself was one of the war's deadliest campaigns. The strategy of Operation Overland was to land a massive invasion force, secure a beachhead, and then break out into France. The sacrifice began on the beaches. At Omaha, American forces were pinned down by veteran German defenders and the invasion teetered on the brink of failure for hours. But the landings were only the beginning. The fight for survival in the bocage, the dense, ancient hedgerows of Normandy, was a new kind of hell. Each field was a self-contained fortress, a perfect ambush site. This was a soldier's war, fought with grenades and bayonets at point-blank range. The campaign to take Normandy cost the Allies over 226,000 casualties. The German losses, combined with those in the subsequent Falaise Pocket, were even higher, and an estimated 20,000 French civilians were killed, mostly by the Allied bombing intended to clear the way. After the breakout from Normandy, it seemed the war might be over for Christmas, but the Third Reich had one last desperate strategic gamble left. In December 1944, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was to smash through the weak American lines and seize the port of Antwerp and force the Western Allies to sue for peace. It was a strategic fantasy, but for the American soldiers on the front line, it was a terrifying reality. They were hit by a blizzard and a blitzkrieg at the same time. The fight for survival was against both the panzers and the bitterest cold Europe had seen in years.
The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle the United States ever fought. Over 19,000 American soldiers were killed in just 6 weeks, with over 89,000 total casualties. The Germans lost just as many, and in doing so, they spent the last of their reserves. The Western Front was broken for good. This brings us to the final battle, the Battle of Berlin. This was not a strategic battle. This was a reckoning. In April 1945, the Soviet Red Army, having fought its way from Stalingrad, reached the capital of the Reich. This was a battle of vengeance. The city was defended by a motley collection of broken Wehrmacht units, SS fanatics, and the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. This was the ultimate sacrifice of the Nazi regime. Old men, teenagers, and boys as young as 12, given rifles and told to fight to the last man. The Soviet strategy was simple: turn the city to dust. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 40,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of tanks encircled and choked Berlin. They advanced block by block, blasting buildings apart, fighting in the subways and sewers. For 2 weeks, the city was an inferno. When the smoke cleared, Hitler was dead, and the city was in ruins. The human cost was, as always, staggering. Over 80,000 Soviet soldiers died in the battle for the city center alone. German military losses are estimated at over 100,000, and a similar number of civilians perished. Berlin was the end. It was the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, that the regime had always promised. It was the final, brutal, and utterly senseless sacrifice. Strategy, sacrifice, survival. These are the three threads woven through every one of these conflicts. The strategies, born in the minds of generals, sought to win objectives, to take hills, to secure resources. But these plans, from blitzkrieg to island hopping, consistently and catastrophically underestimated the human cost. The sacrifice was beyond measure. It was the sacrifice of soldiers, sent into the meat grinders of Stalingrad and Okinawa. It was the sacrifice of civilians, starved in Leningrad or bombed in Berlin. It was the sacrifice of entire generations fed into the furnace of a total ideological war. And finally, the fight for survival. The story of those who endured the unendurable. The soldier in the frozen foxhole, the civilian in the bombed-out basement, the prisoner in the camp. Their resilience is a testament to the human spirit, but also a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can fall. The deadliest battles of World War II are not just historical events. They are warnings.
They are a monument built of millions of lives to the cost of fanaticism, of aggression, and of dehumanization. The world we live in today was built on the ashes of these battles. To understand our present, we must understand the price that was paid in the past. We must remember the strategy. We must honor the sacrifice. And we must never forget the fight for survival.